Welcome, everyone, to our last book talk of 2023. My name is Claire Wasserman, and I'm with Contra Costa JCC, currently filling in for Under 110 Program Director Reba Gam. Today's book talk is sponsored by Contra Costa JCC, Congregation B'nai Shalom, and Jewish Book Council in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. This afternoon, we're honored to have Professor Hannah Wunsch with us. Her book, The Autumn Ghost, How the Battle Against the Polio Epidemic Revolutionized Modern Medical Care, was published in May of this year. Those of you fascinated with medical mysteries and history, The Autumn Ghost will be a perfect addition to your library. So please consider purchasing. Our authors join us out of the generosity of their heart. Before we introduce Dr. Wunsch formally, a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, you may come up with questions, so please write them using the chat function below, and at the end of Dr. Wunsch's talk, we'll be passing them on to her for answers. Hannah Wunsch is a critical care doctor and professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Anesthesiology at Weill Cornell Medicine. Born in Boston and raised in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Hannah attended Harvard College, graduating with a BA in biology. She attended Washington University School of Medicine and received a master's degree in epidemiology from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She completed an anesthesia residency and critical care fellowship at Columbia University. She was on faculty in the Department of Anesthesiology at Columbia and then at the University of Toronto, where she held a Canada Research Chair before moving to Weill Cornell Medicine in 2023. Hannah holds research funding from the NIH, US Department of Defense, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Her work focuses on the delivery and outcomes of critical care using large databases. Her research has been published in The Lancet, JAMA, BMJ, and many specialty journals. Hannah's writing has also appeared in The Globe and Mail, the Literary Review of Canada, McSweeney's, and other journals. She lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and the village of Woods Hole on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Before I pass the virtual mic to Hannah, I'd like to share a few of the many praises her book received. The Autumn Ghost is a tale told with tremendous compassion and precision. She brings a critical chapter in medical history alive with style, wit, and an impeccable eye for detail. Dr. Hannah Wunsch's The Autumn Ghost is a perfectly pitched medical mystery that will captivate you from page one. Steeped in spellbinding history about a 1950s medical revolution that ultimately saved us during the COVID pandemic, this is a work of global importance. And now, Hannah, please take it away.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction. You guys now know my entire CV. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to all of you. Thank you for all of you to tune in on an afternoon in December. Happy belated Hanukkah and New Year to all of you. And I'm really thrilled to get to share my book with you. This was a labor of love. As you heard, I have a day job that is not writing books. And so, really did this because I felt passionate about it and wanted to share this story with people. And so I really appreciate these types of opportunities to directly share it with you. I do have some slides to share. And so I'm just going to open that up, and please tell me if there's any issues with it. I want to share with you the story of this book and also kind of along the way why I wrote it. And so to kind of address that up front, I think of this as an origin story. And it's really the origin story for how did we get from wards and care in hospitals that looked like this, where if you, for instance, had pneumonia, you were essentially tucked in a corner here, given some morphine and left to die, to modern critical care, which is very much looks like this, and was front and center in COVID, and also is front and center in the care of many, many, many patients who don't have COVID, but who are critically ill. And obviously, this is a very long evolution with a lot that went into it. But it turns out 20 years ago, I stumbled on, oops, just having trouble advancing there, stumbled on a story in this book, The Rise and Fall of Modern Medicine. I was a master's student and was reading this on the side. And it's a book where each chapter is an important point in medical history in the 20th century. So the development of different antibiotics and insulin. And then there was this one short chapter about a polio epidemic in 1952 and how important it was for the development of critical care, my specialty. And it's also a very dramatic story, as you're about to hear, and it really stayed with me. And I decided that sort of the world needed to know about this story, that it was important and really hadn't been told beyond this one chapter for the general public. Now, I imagine a lot of you lived through the polio years and may have strong memories of polio. For me, despite having gone to medical school, I knew nothing about polio to start with. And to sort of, the first thing I had to do was learn about polio. We did have a close family friend growing up who was in a wheelchair having had polio, and this was explained to me. That was sort of my sum total exposure to polio. Other than, I think, for most children nowadays, really their only experience of learning about polio would be learning about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the fact that he had polio. And that's probably most of what we know. And then personally, I stumbled across this book, and whatever you think of Philip Roth, I recommend the book itself, Nemesis. It's fiction, but it really evokes, again, a time many of you may remember. For me, a time I didn't remember, but really felt that he captured the fear of polio in the 1940s in this story of one summer in New Jersey. Now, for those of you who haven't thought about polio in a long time, if at all, just a very quick primer. It's a virus. It's called an enterovirus, which means it's an oral fecal transmission. And actually, interestingly, like COVID-19, most people exposed to polio never knew they had it and never developed any symptoms and just developed immunity to it. If you did have symptoms, often as a child, it would be these sort of non-specific symptoms there on the left. And of course, a small percentage, less than 5% who got exposed to polio developed some sort of paralysis, often of limbs, but that of course was the dreaded complication. And you had the March of Dimes, which was the organization, the fundraising organization actually set up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that used images like this of children in braces or wheelchairs to raise money for polio. Now, when it came to polio being deadly, there were two ways that it could be deadly. It was all paralysis. One was that it actually went into the spinal cord and it took out the nerves that were there for the muscles of respiration, for breathing. And so people would end up with weakness in their breathing. And that was a spinal form of respiratory paralysis. But you could also have the virus hit what were called the bulbar nerves, the nerves in the brainstem that controlled swallowing and secretion control in the back of the throat and coughing. And that was in fact the most deadly form of polio, about 90% mortality. And horrifically, people would literally be drowning in their own secretions, unable to clear. But really, any type of paralysis that involved breathing of any kind was pretty much completely deadly with polio until 1928. And in 1928, you get this first revolution in care focused on polio, and that is the development of the iron lung. This is Professor Philip Drinker, who, along with Louis Agassiz Shaw, a colleague at Harvard School of Public Health, came up with the iron lung. And one of them was doing an experiment, and that is a cat there in that photo. And this cat was sealed into a box. And they were interested in a couple of things. One was whether or not the cat could breathe through its skin, which I find fascinating that in 1928 they hadn't figured out that they can't. But they were also measuring the size of the breaths the cat was taking, and they would paralyze the cat. And then with that plunger, they would suck air out of that box that correlated with the amount of the breath that the cat was taking. And he walked by, Professor Philip Drinker, and realized that actually, if you just use that plunger going in and out, you could keep that cat breathing when it was paralyzed. And this is negative pressure ventilation. This is the concept of the iron lung. And just to pause for a moment, because you may not think very much about your breathing, but the way we breathe naturally is negative pressure ventilation. What we do is our chest wall, our muscles actually suck our lungs open and air rushes in to fill that space. But we actually create negative pressure in our chest as we expand our chest wall and push down on our diaphragm. And that's exactly what this box was doing with the cat. And so what you might recognize, the form that eventually took, and sorry, this is just a little diagram to show you that you get this, you get the body sealed in and it sucks the air out from around the body, and this forces the lungs to expand and the air to rush into the mouth and into the lungs to expand. Someone who was familiar with the iron lung once said to me recently, like, I hope you'll explain how it works because I've never fully understood. So apologies if this is well known to you, but often people haven't stopped to think about how it actually works. So this is probably the kind of image you're more familiar with of what iron lungs actually looked like once they were fully developed. And they were lifesavers. They, for respiratory paralysis, allowed people to survive who really couldn't before. Now, there were some caveats to that. One was it was pretty scary as a patient to be in one of these. People would wake up and feel like they were in a coffin. Another was those are actually portholes there because they had to find a way while keeping that seal around the neck to get in and take care of the patient. And so nurses hated this because it was very hard to actually take care of patients in iron lungs. And the third piece is that for bulbar polio, it actually wasn't very helpful because you can imagine if you've got secretions in the back of your throat, and you suck the lungs open, actually all you do is suck all those secretions down into the lungs and people would still die of pneumonia. And so even though it saved many lives of people who had paralysis from polio, there was still a 90% mortality with bulbar polio, even as iron lungs became used more and more. And so by the 1950s, this is kind of the most famous picture of the use of iron lungs. They were in widespread use, particularly in the United States, where there was a lot of money to purchase them and deploy them. So this is where my story comes in, and it takes place at the Blydam Hospital in Copenhagen in 1952. This is a picture of the hospital. It's actually since been knocked down, which I think is really sad. But it was the main infectious disease hospital for the city. And there was a man named Henry Kai Alexander Lassen, and he was the head of the hospital. And he was, in fact, a world expert on polio. But they never had a major epidemic. And because of that, they had stocked away one iron lung for use when someone came in with respiratory paralysis from polio. And over the years, they'd seen some waves, but nothing too severe. Now, I started to research him in this period, and I ended up taking a little bit of a detour, which ended up being absolutely fascinating. And just wanted to share with you, I met Henry Lassen's grandson, and he was showing me this picture, and I was a little distracted by the crazy sweater that his friend is wearing there. But he said in passing, "Oh, that's his friend Mogensfog. He was a hero of the resistance." And I sort of said, "Well, like, resistance? What are we talking about here?" He said, no, World War II. They're both doctors, but his friend was a major player in the resistance as Denmark was invaded by the Nazis and occupied in World War II. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And then I was speaking with one of the patients who was cared for in the Blydam Hospital, and she pulled out this document and showed it to me. And we can talk about this later, but I actually don't speak Danish. So I said, sort of, what the heck is this? And she said, oh, this was my ration card from 1952 when I was hospitalized, that we had to hand this over. And I said, wait a minute, like 1952, it's well past the war. And I was intrigued by that. And it was a reminder. She said, oh, yes, no, we still felt very much the effects of World War II. And then I was researching the first anesthesiologist in Denmark who was relevant to my story, Ernst Trier Morch. And it turns out those medals he's wearing were for his work in the resistance in World War II in Denmark. And I found, in fact, that many of the doctors who became part of my story, and the nurses as well, a lot of them had this background of having been part of the resistance movement against the Nazis during the war. And Ernst Trier Morch in particular was important in helping to get Jews out of Denmark over to Sweden in 1943. In fact, I discovered that the best interview I found with him was actually on the USC Shoah Foundation website. He himself was not Jewish, but his role was so important in what he'd done during World War II that they did a full, I think it's almost 2-hour interview with him. Absolutely fascinating. He's a little bit of a storyteller, so so don't believe everything he says if you go listen to this, but he tells some good stories. And the other piece that he was involved with that was also very important, this is actually a photo taken outside the Bligham Hospital, one of the buildings, in 1945, what was called the White Buses that went into Germany before the war was over. And they had negotiated between Sweden and Germany to extract prisoners in a couple of the concentration camps to return them to Sweden and also to Denmark, including some Jewish prisoners there. And Ernst Trier Mort was one of the doctors who volunteered to go. And the Bligham Hospital and Henry Lassen were the ones who took in many of these prisoners who were, of course, incredibly malnourished and sick at the end of World War II. And this is just a picture actually of them on the ferry from Denmark to Sweden. And there's all kind of archival material. So a little bit of an aside, I go into it a lot more in my book, but it turns out that these doctors, a lot of them had these bonds from the war. At the same time, there was a lot that sort of had been put on hold because of the war, and a lot of information that wasn't well transmitted between countries and between places during the war because of these boundaries and barriers. But the war was over, and in 1952, everything was fine, except that in July and August of 1952 at the Bligham Hospital, they started to see this, 50 cases a day of polio, and 10 to 12 of them a day had respiratory failure. And crucially, most of those were bulbar polio, the most deadly form. The other crucial piece to know is in the United States, polio was usually referred to as the summer plague because it would peak in July and August. However, in Scandinavian countries, for whatever reason, we don't fully know except that it's further north, and for some reason that mattered, the peak was generally in September and October. So here they were, not even into September, and they knew that what became known as, in my book, as the autumn ghost was not going to peak for a couple of more months. And so they were beside themselves as to what to do. When I visited the city archives in Copenhagen, they dumped this big black book in front of me along with all the other stuff I'd requested. And when I opened it, I realized it was their book of deaths for 1952, where they recorded every death in the hospital. And in January and February, it's diphtheria and tetanus and things like that. And then in July and August, all you see is polio, polio, polio. And by mid-August, they'd lost almost that 90%. 27 out of 31 with bulbar polio patients had died, 90% mortality for those patients. Now, on these pages, every death entry is signed by the doctor involved. And there's one name that comes up a couple of times. His name is Dr. Bjornbo. And apologies to anyone who speaks Danish on the line. It doesn't quite sound like that in Danish. And he was a young doctor, and he started badgering his boss, Henry Lassen, to bring in a young man that he had met, another doctor by the name of Bjorn Ibsen. Now, the two of them had met a few months earlier. There's a whole backstory to how they met. I won't go into it, but Mogens Bjornbo had been impressed by this young doctor he'd met. Now, why was he impressed? Well, Bjorn Ibsen was interested in training in anesthesiology, and that was very unusual at that point in Denmark. When he expressed interest in doing this, Ernst Trier Mort, that hero of the resistance, was the only anesthesiologist in all of Denmark. And he told Bjorn Ibsen, if you want to learn anesthesia, you can't stay here. You need to go west. So in 1949, he traveled to Mass General Hospital at Harvard in Boston and spent a year there learning to be an anesthesiologist. And so when he came back, he had a very unusual skill set in terms of his knowledge of clinical medicine compared to most of the other doctors in Denmark. But crucially, there was another thing he learned in Boston. He felt it was a much less hierarchical system, and that there was a lot more exchange of ideas. And these are a couple of his quotes from later in his life reflecting on this. He said, "At conferences, the young American doctors expressed themselves freely and without inhibitions. I began to understand here that I was among doctors who thought differently and along other lines than those I was familiar with." And he really took this to heart. And for instance, he said at first he thought there were a lot more complications of surgery in Boston. But then he realized that no, actually, it was just that they talked about them because they wanted to learn from them and try to improve, and that this was very different from his experience in Denmark. So Lassen was not very excited to meet Bjorn Ibsen because there was this guy in this specialty that barely existed who he'd never heard of, who was 10, 20 years younger than him, but he had nothing else to try to help his patients. And so on August 25th, in 1952, he invited Bjorn Ibsen to join him in his office, along with about 20 other people, to hear what he had to offer. And Ibsen walked in, and Lassen said to him, "What do you know about taking care of polio patients?" And Ibsen's response was, "Never taken care of a polio patient in my life." So this is where I think Lassen deserves a lot of credit. Rather than kicking him out, which I think would have been actually completely justified, he said, "I'm going to show you what these patients look like." And he took them on a tour of the hospital to see the polio patients. Now, what he saw was this: the patients dying of polio had a number of symptoms. They had high blood pressure, a fast heart rate, they were twitching, they had confusion and clammy skin. And when he asked Henry Lassen, "What's going on with these patients?" he was told, "This is polio. It's the end stages of polio. It overwhelms the body. The virus has gotten into the brain. This is what it looks like. There's nothing more that can be done." Now, Bjorn Ibsen looked at these same patients and these same symptoms, and he said, "Actually, I don't think that's what's going on." A quick pause. He thought that they had what's called carbon dioxide retention. And this is a reminder of breathing, where you breathe in, oxygen comes into the lungs, it gets taken on the red blood cells into the organs, it gets used, and then you have this exhaust of carbon dioxide that, of course, you blow out, and you keep breathing in, breathing out, and everything stays in equilibrium. Now, he was looking at these patients who were struggling to breathe, and he said, "I don't think this is a virus overwhelming the brain. I think this is what happens to the body when carbon dioxide can't get out. They're not able to breathe it off, carbon dioxide retention." Turned out they had coincidentally tapped the one man in the world who was doing experiments on carbon dioxide and breathing in the operating room with this giant machine that measured exhaled carbon dioxide. And he had, in fact, published a paper that very year on the topic, examining what happened to his patients when he had them breathe fast in the operating room when they were under anesthesia, and then when he stopped having them breathe. And he noticed when he stopped breathing for them, they were paralyzed in the operating room during surgery, that they had the exact same symptoms that these polio patients had. So he said, "I think I can actually help." And what he proposed was this. He said, "I think you should do a tracheostomy," which is just a little tube in the neck into the lungs to what's called protect the airway. And Lassen said, "Well, we've tried that. We've tried putting that little tube in. It doesn't seem to do much." He said, no, you can't stop there. You also have to breathe for them and give them what he called positive pressure ventilation. So this was radical because the only type of ventilation used outside the operating room was that negative pressure, that the iron lung that sucked the lungs open. This was the exact opposite. It's pushing air into the lungs with a bag of oxygen or air. And it's what they did in the operating room. So he was used to doing it, but it was not used outside the operating room. And so that was the part that was the kind of radical leap. And what he suggested was to use exactly what he used in the operating room. So for anyone who likes sort of nerdy diagrams, this one's actually quite simple. It's just a rubber bag that you squeeze, soda lime, which actually extracts the carbon dioxide, and then oxygen that's hooked up to that little tube that goes into the neck. That's all it is. And he was saying, "I think we need to do this to your patients, and I think that this might actually stabilize them." So Lassen was apparently not particularly convinced, but having nothing else to try, he said, "Okay, I'm going to let you do this, but I'm going to have you try it only on one patient, and I will choose that patient." The very next day, August 26, 1952, a little girl by the name of Vivi Ebert was admitted to the hospital. She was 12 years old at the time. She's about 9 in this photo here. And this is the house in Copenhagen she lived in with her mother and her grandparents. And she had classic bulbar polio when she was admitted. And so they knew they could look at her and see her symptoms and knew she had a 90% mortality. Essentially, she had a death sentence. And the next morning, August 27th, 1952, Professor Lassen went round to examine her, and sure enough, she was dying. And he pointed to her and he said, "She's the one, try it on her." So they wheeled her into a side room and they called in Dr. Ibsen and they called in a surgeon to make that little incision in her neck and put in that tube. And then Dr. Ibsen made a small mistake. He was worried that if he gave her general anesthesia for the surgery, that she was so sick and so near the end of her life that she might just, her system might collapse and she might just die. So he said, just give her a little bit of local anesthetic in the area and do the surgery that way. And they did that. But there was a little extra bleeding because of that. And so by the time he took over her care, she wasn't breathing and she had blood that had trickled into her lungs and put her into what's called bronchospasm, where the airway clamps down. It's really, truly every anesthesiologist's nightmare. And the amazing thing is we have her entire medical record that was in the archives in Copenhagen. And it's been translated, and we have his record from that day, minute by minute. And he wrote, now in a situation where we cannot perform ventilation because of her spasms and agitation. His plan was to blow air into her lungs. That was going to stabilize her. And he couldn't do it. She had clamped down. Everybody left the room to go to lunch. They didn't want to see a little girl die. And Lassen patted him on the back and said, if she's still like this when I return from lunch, you need to stop what you're doing and just let her go in peace. So he took a big risk. He knew the only way to break that spasm was actually to give her that general anesthetic and get her body to relax. So he gave her pentothal 100 milligrams at 1:17 p.m. And he recorded 15 minutes later, the patient is immediately warm and dry. He got lucky. She stabilized, it worked, she relaxed, he was able to start blowing air into her lungs. And when everybody came back from lunch, they found that rather than a dead child, which is what they expected, she was actually awake and pink and alert. And he was sitting there calmly squeezing this bag, blowing air into her lungs for her to keep her alive. Over the course of that night, he proved that he could continue to do this. He and 2 other doctors took turns at her bedside, hand ventilating her. And Lassen knew a good thing when he saw it, and he recognized that this was the way forward. And he said, right, we're going to do this to every patient who comes in who's not breathing well with polio. There was only one problem. Nowadays, when this happens, we put that tube in either the neck or down in the mouth, down the throat. And then once we've got someone stable, after 5-10 minutes, we wheel in a ventilator, we turn on a switch, and we hook up to the machine that will keep doing that, ventilating them. They had no ventilators. They existed, but only in a few operating rooms in Sweden and the United States. And there was not a single ventilator in all of Denmark at this point. Nobody knew really about them or how to use them. So instead, they recognized they literally needed hands. And they called on the medical students of Copenhagen to come sit at the bedside of every single patient with respiratory failure to hand ventilate them 24 hours a day. And they came, initially dozens, then hundreds, and ultimately 1,200 medical and dental students who took it in shifts to sit at the bedside doing this hand ventilation. A lot of them had never touched a patient before. It was absolutely terrifying. At the same time, it was the most exhilarating thing some of them had ever experienced, getting to actually support these patients. At one point, they had 70 patients ventilated this way at one time. These patients, many of them, of course, were awake because polio does not impact the brain. And so they became quite close. They got to know each other, became friends. And this was actually incredibly important as well because this was visiting, kind of shades of COVID here. There were very strict visiting rules, particularly in the early phase when people were contagious. So the beds would be pushed against the windows and parents, as you can see, would be peeking in. But this made the medical students sort of even more important to these patients. I actually got to meet one of them. She was 90 years old, outside Copenhagen, and she became an anesthesiologist because of her experience in this epidemic and was understandably incredibly proud of what they'd accomplished. She unfortunately died last year, but she did name one of her children for one of the patients she cared for in this epidemic. And then amazingly, we actually have some film footage, so you can actually see what the epidemic looked like and get a little sense. You can see her squeezing that bag there. And importantly, that bag only reinflates if air or oxygen goes into it again. So if there's any kink in the system or any problem with it, it becomes impossible to ventilate. My book details a lot of the stories of sort of the struggles and the kind of harrowing events as they figured out on the fly how to do this safely, and what was needed. And you can see they let people occasionally eat and drink. They also did put in feeding tubes. I often get asked, and they would just blend up whatever the meal was for the day and stick it down the feeding tube. So this was incredibly successful. They went from 87% mortality before this intervention down to about 36% midway through, and all the way down to just 11% mortality at the tail of the epidemic. You know, I dream of finding an intervention for my patients that can make such a big difference in how they do. It's really extraordinary. And importantly, the other thing that came out of this was not just recognition that this worked, but the development of what they initially called mechanical students that became mechanical ventilators that did get rolled in and started to be used towards the tail end of the epidemic. And you get this explosion in ventilator development. Importantly, Henry Lassen recognized what they had done was really important to get out to the world so that others would know about this. And so he published very early in 1953 this paper in The Lancet, one of the main medical journals, about the epidemic and what they'd achieved. And you will note, for anyone who is an academic out there, there is one name on this paper, HCA Lassen. This caused a lot of consternation between him and Bjorn Ibsen later in their careers, as he basically tried to take all of the claim and credit for this new intervention. But importantly, at the same time, he did get the word out, and that was really important. Now, what about Bjorn Ibsen? He left after the epidemic was over and took a job at the municipal hospital, the community hospital nearby. And there he had a vision. And this was the next big step. In these windows here, he created in 1953, just a year later, what most of us consider the first modern intensive care unit. Why do I say that? Well, he took a lot of what he'd learned and read here from taking care of the polio patients, having a dedicated area for the care of really sick patients, having 24/7 staffing. They had a thing which it's in the book, but I won't go into it here, about blood gas analysis, invasive mechanical ventilation, and specialized nursing. He took from his knowledge of care in the operating room, how to do resuscitation and supporting other organs, and the idea that you need to very frequently monitor people's vital signs. And then this last piece is the key piece, where we go from polio to the broader medical community. He recognized that you could support people who were struggling to breathe, not just with polio, but with any problem. That it could be a pneumonia, it could be a trauma, it could be someone after surgery. They would all benefit from this care. And that really is the core of modern intensive care, this idea that we can take people and stabilize them with all kinds of organ difficulties like respiratory failure. This did make it to North America about 5 years later. There was a bit of a lag in terms of people recognizing the importance of these techniques and all of this, but Peter Safar in Baltimore, Max Harry-Weil in Los Angeles, and Barry Faley in Toronto all created first intensive care units in North America in 1958. And really from there, they just exploded across the world. Although I do want to acknowledge that there are places in the world, of course, where there is still no access to intensive care. And certainly there are big swaths of Africa where, you know, this is only dreamed of. And this is kind of what it looks like now. A lot of gadgets, a lot of machinery, but actually at its core, what I do every day is not all that different from that first intensive care unit in terms of these core concepts of how we take care of patients. And I thought a lot about that during COVID, you know, sort of recognizing that we were just doing the exact same thing they were doing for those polio patients as we stabilized people who were having difficulty breathing. So I want to talk briefly at the end here about the legacy of polio. One thing I learned doing this book, I went in thinking, right, I'm going to tell this story about polio, and I'm going to tell this story about critical care and mechanical ventilation. And as I went along, I did recognize there were all these other pieces to what polio's legacy was. And of course, the one that most people think about is the vaccine. These are the things that came out of that, really that one epidemic I describe in detail in the book. But there's also these other things that I think are just important to acknowledge: rehabilitation medicine, disability rights, and then things like the long-term sequelae of viruses. A lot of the polio patients I interviewed and many survivors now have new weakness and fatigue and symptoms that are called post-polio syndrome that occurs 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. And that's something that we can really learn from polio, that, you know, it's not over when the epidemic ends. And I think that's important to recognize. I do want to acknowledge, you know, for those of you who have knowledge and experience of rehabilitation medicine, maybe some of you even have been here, Warm Springs in Georgia really became that FDR, and that's him in the middle there, founded, created, what really became the model for good rehabilitation medicine for physical rehab. He recognized you needed occupational therapy and physical therapy and orthopedic surgery and massage therapy, that you needed all of this in one place. And he also created a space that was accessible for those with disabilities. And this was a real important impetus for a lot of the future of rehabilitation medicine. The concept that it was that bed rest was not the best thing for people, and that immobilization was not the way forward, came out of really needing to figure out how to rehabilitate polio patients. Some of you may recognize this photo on the left, Sister Kenny, who was not actually a nun or a nurse, but had very strong views about how to help individuals with polio recover, function optimally. And it involved hot packs and stretching and early intervention, was ultimately adopted across the world as the best way forward for care of individuals like this. And then I want to acknowledge one last piece, what are called the respinauts. This was the first time with polio patients that we created or ended up with individuals who became dependent on machines for life. And Vivi Ebert was one of them. So she survived. She lived into her 30s, but she was always dependent on ventilators. There's another woman who I talk about in the book, and she became actually a beautiful, she became a poet, and her poetry is absolutely beautiful. And there's some excerpts in the book, named Rosa Abramson. She too was dependent on a ventilator for the rest of her life. And so it's important to recognize that there were, not everyone's life returned to as it had been before, even with this intervention, and that this has become a major component and issue in intensive care, of the fact that many people need long-term ongoing support after this. I'm almost done, but I want to share with you this last film. This is actually taken at the Blyden Hospital in the summer after the epidemic. And interestingly, I show this to medical audiences to sort of galvanize them and say, see what they could do even when ventilators had just been invented. And yet the humanity to me in this film footage is just front and center, because they got them outside, right? They're tethered to machines. It must have been terrifying to do this, but they recognize how important this was to give them that sense of the wider world. They do things that we also would not do, like let them smoke attached to oxygen. Every time I see this, my heart stops. But, I think it's just it's nice to see the survivors, right? And how they were also treated so humanely. And and you can also get a sense of the machinery that they were actually using in these early days, and how very simple it was in a way. And then I also use this little boy as kind of a teaching point with my residents and others I teach. You can tell he has actually a tracheostomy there. So he's been on a ventilator or been ventilated, but you can see his arms are still paralyzed. And I always say to people, someone took the time to pin those little badges on him to try to make this just a little bit more bearable. And I think about him a lot when I'm at the bedside taking care of patients, when I've got all this machinery and stuff around and high-tech gadgetry. And yet I often stop and think, what's the little thing that I maybe can do to make this a little bit easier? So I feel like I've learned an enormous amount myself about caring for patients from a lot of this research that I did for this book. I do want to just end by mentioning the vaccine. For those of you who were alive in 1955, I imagine many of you have very strong memories of where you were when you first either heard about the vaccine or got the vaccine, because it was such a momentous event. If you ever need an advertisement for vaccination, this is it. This is polio cases in the United States in the 20th century, and you can see this precipitous drop from the intervention of the vaccine in 1955. It's not been zero all the way through. We had a case in New York just a year and a half ago. And although we're very close to polio eradication, we are not there yet. And for those of you interested, there are maps like this which track weekly where the polio cases are occurring in the world. And of course, unfortunately, war and a lot of other vaccine hesitancy has really made this a lot more scary, even than it was maybe 5-10 years ago, as we see increasing vaccine hesitancy and pockets that are getting harder and harder to reach in terms of getting to the finish line. I also want to acknowledge that since 1988, I pulled this off the web, worldwide 1.5 million lives saved by polio vaccine. 18 million able to walk who wouldn't otherwise. Really remarkable numbers, but also to give you a sense of how important this other sort of lesser known intervention that's due to polio, mechanical ventilation, is. I've estimated in the US, 15 million lives have been saved by mechanical ventilation in that same time period. So not to, try to say which is more important or better than the other, they're both important. But I was thrilled to be able to write a book that really highlighted how important this other story is in terms of the ways that polio has made a difference to all of us in the world. This is the map from 1952 in Copenhagen. That actually, that picture of Henry Lassen I showed you, it was actually in his office in 1952. And he sent out medical students to track every single case of polio. And he put a pin in the map for every case at the address. They were trying to figure out the pattern. They couldn't. Each color is a different month. But I also want to just acknowledge at the end that these pins were individuals, and I was lucky enough to get to meet many of these individuals who told me their stories of the epidemic, of the aftermath of the epidemic, of their lives dealing with residual paralysis from polio. Every one of them expressed such relief when the vaccine came in, knowing it wouldn't help them, but that it would help people they loved. And a lot of their stories are all in the book, sort of interwoven with the stories of the doctors and the nurses and the students and everybody else. So I always say happy 70th anniversary of the first intensive care unit in the world, 2023. And that's Bjorn Ibsen in later life. I was just at a Christmas party hosted by his daughter. So I've been privileged to get to know them as well. And I'll stop there. I appreciate the shout out for buying the book, but I'm also just happy to answer any questions that you might have about it.
Great, thank you so much. We currently have one question in the chat. This one is from Stan Heimowitz. His question is, where does Jonas Salk fit in?
Yeah, so Jonas Salk, and I do talk about him in the book. I kind of tell the story of the vaccine development as a kind of a side piece, recognizing how important it is. And I juxtapose a lot the fact that the ultimate goal was prevention, which was the vaccine, and the intervention of mechanical ventilation and ultimately critical care. It's all downstream after it's happened, right? And so that was not really the goal. But without the vaccine, you did need some way to try to help people. So Jonas Salk is the one who comes up with what's called the killed virus vaccine, which is the one that comes out in 1955. He was at the University of Pittsburgh during many of those years. He was quite junior as well, but was sort of doggedly determined to keep going on the vaccine development throughout the late 1940s and into the 50s. Ultimately, it was a very large trial run by the March of Dimes, National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, that he himself did not run, but obviously was involved in. And so it is his vaccine that became the first vaccine that was rolled out. Later in 1962, you get the Sabin vaccine, which is the sugar cube that a lot of people remember. That's the oral vaccine, and that's what's called a live attenuated vaccine. And I'm happy to go into more details about those. So it's sort of all happening in parallel. And what's sort of heartbreaking is this 1952 epidemic. They're so close to the finish line with a vaccine, and yet it's not available yet. And so it's sort of a fascinating time. It's the last big peak of polio cases that occurs.
Thank you. This question is from Merlin Dorfman. I had understood from a biography of FDR that massage is useless for polio patients. Is that true?
I don't think we know for sure what the exact role of massage is. I think what became very clear was that there were things, I think they were called Toronto frames. They would literally strap people down for 6 months with this idea that no movement was best. And massage took its place as part of this idea of just early movement and mobilization was good for the muscles. And I think the idea of the massage, was the idea that you were just sort of stretching the muscles a bit, stimulating them. Whether that piece alone is, good or bad, or whether it's just, range of motion and movement, whether that would be equally as effective. I don't think we know for sure. It became part and parcel of it. But there were a lot of patients who got contractures, meaning right, their muscles sort of clamped down. And so without the massage to sort of soften the muscles, a lot of them literally sort of couldn't relax those muscles. So there probably was a role for massage just in that piece of trying to get those muscles to relax that went along with the hot packs that were sort of the famous piece of Sister Kenny's treatment. So a little wishy-washy on that one. The other thing is a lot of polio research stops in 1955 or thereabouts, right? So there's a lot about polio and treatment and care of polio patients that we might have learned more about if the vaccine hadn't come in. Not that I'm regretting that in any way.
Great. So there's another question. How did they protect the medical students and dental students from getting polio while sitting there ventilating the patients all those hours? That's really
It's a great question. Nobody knows for sure. So they were supposed to wear masks to protect themselves, and they were quite, I think, careful about hand washing. But remarkably, not a single person who cared for polio patients during that epidemic got polio. Nobody knows why, given how big an epidemic it was, how transmissible it was. A couple of the children of the doctors got polio during that epidemic, but they were not directly exposed in the hospital, of course. And there are other epidemics where it was very clear. I mean, there are some epidemics, horrendous numbers of nurses coming down with polio. So I wish I could say, oh, they used great, careful technique to ensure they didn't get infected. If anything, it's the opposite. There's stories of the medical students sleeping on the used mattresses that hadn't been cleaned of the polio patients. And one harrowing story of one little girl where they couldn't get the ventilation system to work. And as she turned blue, he actually took his mouth to the tracheostomy in her neck and started blowing into it to keep her alive until they could get the system set up again. And he didn't get polio. It's really remarkable, and really speaks to their heroism that they went in there knowing it was a risk and took that risk. It's hard to fathom.
It's true. It's amazing. Sandy Bothwick has a comment. My recollection is that we were giving a polio prevention drink rather than a shot. Where does the liquid prevention fall in terms of prevention?
Yeah, so this is the question of the two different. I think when you mean the liquid, it's the drops that went on the sugar cube that people took. So this comes back to the fact that there are two types of polio vaccination. There's the Salk vaccine, which is an injection and is a killed virus. Literally, they took I think it's formaldehyde or formalin or something, and they made sure the virus was dead. And the idea was you inject it, you expose the body to the dead pieces of the virus, you develop immunity. What Sabin developed was called live attenuated vaccine, and that was the oral vaccine. And the idea was you make it into a virus that won't cause illness, but is still living. And that gives you better immunity. Why? Because it actually goes into the gut, which is where the actual virus would enter your body. And so the thing about that vaccine is it keeps you from getting the virus because your gut has the immunity. The problem with the Salk vaccine is that it will keep you from getting sick from the virus, but it actually doesn't keep you from contracting the virus. So in order to actually stop transmission of polio around the world, you needed to use the Sabin vaccine, the oral vaccine. And that's what they're still using in the places where there is active transmission. The one problem with the Sabin vaccine is in about 1 in a million cases, it mutates by itself back into a virulent form. And so you run the risk in a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of people that they will actually get polio from the vaccine. Or if they're around people who are not vaccinated, they will get polio from the vaccine, from your excretion of it. So that's actually what happened in that New York case that occurred about 1.5 years ago. The person who got polio was unvaccinated and came into contact with someone who had received the oral Sabin vaccine and it had mutated. So it was, when they track the virus, they track wild type, meaning it's the real one out there in the world, and they track cases that are vaccine derived because they recognize these are two different things going on. Now, this is why we don't use the oral vaccine in the United States. The feeling was it's gone, it's not circulating in the US, and there is this tiny risk that the public doesn't want, right? That like somebody's going to get polio if they're given the vaccine. So we've switched over to the Salk vaccine, or a newer version of it. But there's a lot of debate about how and when you switch over a country, when is it safe to do that? And that's why you hear about both. And that's why some of you probably received both. Some might have received only the oral. Now, I only got the injections when I was growing up. And there's a lot of debate back and forth. It's quite a complicated area of study, but really important, obviously.
One of our guests joined late, and he's asking to discuss intubation, tracheostomy versus iron lung. I know you already explained that in the beginning. And
yeah, well, I'm happy just to kind of recap that the negative pressure ventilation is the iron lung. It sucks the lungs open. It's great for certain forms of respiratory failure, and in fact can still be used now if somebody just has weakness of their muscles in their chest. But for most things where you worry about secretions in the back of the throat and pneumonia and things like that, we've moved to either tracheostomy more often. What we do now, and I think this is important to recognize, we put a tube down the mouth into the throat and into the trachea. And that's for people who don't need to be ventilated for very long periods of time. That's our standard that we use. Only if you need to be ventilated for a long period of time, like weeks to months, do we do the tracheostomy. But either way, you're blowing air into the lungs. That said, there is ongoing research on moving back to negative pressure ventilation, again, recognizing that it might be more physiologic. It's actually the way our bodies naturally breathe. And it may be in 10 years' time, if you walk into an ICU, you may actually see not the old iron lungs, but very modern versions that sort of strap on the body in some way and help the muscles to move. So there is modern research back into negative pressure ventilation, which is pretty interesting. There are a few places that keep iron lungs running as well. They have a few patients left who prefer, when they have respiratory failure related to polio from back in the day, they prefer to be in an iron lung than on a ventilator. And so they're kept running for those individual patients.
And are these iron lungs in the United States or other parts of the world?
So the ones I know of are in London, and I think there are one or two hospitals, certainly within the last 10, 15 years in the US, there were a couple of hospitals that still had one or two that were running, but I think that number is dwindling rapidly. Yeah.
We have a comment from Dan Greenup. He mentions your lovely talk. I learned a lot. I would add to the legacy of polio and the development of polio vaccine, the expansion of NIH funding and support of biotechnology in the US, and the development expansion of the FDA for licensure of new safe vaccines as a result of the Qatar incident and failure to inactivate early vaccine lots properly.
No, that's a great point. I mean, I think there's a lot of things, and if people are interested more in the vaccine story and the development and all of that, there's a fantastic book by David Oshinsky called Polio, an American Story, which is really about that, that American side of the research, and how the fundraising for polio was incredible in terms of its ability to raise money for the research and treatment of a specific disease. And it became this sort of model for that. And then to the point about the Qatar incident, which just for those of you not familiar, after the Salk vaccine came out, there were 5 different companies that were tasked with producing it. One did not follow correctly the protocol for killing the virus, and a batch of vaccine went out that had live virus in it, and it paralyzed a couple hundred people and killed about 20. And this was a horrific start to the rollout of the polio vaccine. What I find actually most remarkable is that they still got to 90% vaccination rates within a few years. I can't even imagine what would happen if something like that occurred now, right, with that catastrophic a rollout. And it speaks to the fact that it was a very different time, and in many ways a very forgiving public, that there was some hesitancy that developed, and I recount one of the stories that's actually quite horrific of someone who hesitated to get the vaccine, partially because of that, and the consequences. But yes, I appreciate that there were all kinds of rules and regulations that were at least, partially spurred on by some of that, and a lot of that is detailed in a different great book.
We have a question and we're running out of time. Please discuss polio and pregnancy. Does the polio virus pass through the placenta? I'm a retired OBGYN, says Bob Polish.
That is a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that. I think not, because my understanding is there were women, who were pregnant when they got polio, and I don't have any sort of memory or knowledge of them, where part of the story was it got passed on to their fetus or their babies. So, but I don't know that for sure. It's a great question.
So yeah, the recording will become available to all who signed up, and we'll probably send it within a day or so after editing it slightly. There's one last question, I think, and we can close this. Is the Qatar incident why we have the VAERS and no liability system?
What was the first one? Why we have?
It's the Qatar incident, why we have the VAERS. VAERS? I don't know, there's like initials, VAERS, and no.
Right, the regulations. Yeah, I'll be honest. That is not my area of expertise, and so I don't know whether that alone was the reason. It sounds like whoever asked the question may actually be more knowledgeable than me, so I won't wade in there. I do know it was important in spurring at least some of the regulations around vaccine development, but its exact role, I'm afraid I don't know. It's a great question.
Dr. Wunsch, thank you for this enlightening talk. We truly appreciate your work and to help us envision and learn more on this crucial chapter of in medical history. I'm sure many of our audience today will be visiting their local bookstores or the ones online later. We all wish you a healthy, happy, and safe new year and hope to see you in 2024. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and you can find me online easily. My email's available. Please, if you have other questions, I'm happy to hear from people. So take care and happy holidays to all.
Happy holidays. Bye now.